In this video, I want to share some super fun technique with you on how you can create acid type sequences with some sort of generative touch, and here's how they sound like. As you could see, I was using Arturia Pigments for creating this patch, and while some things are specific to pigments, especially stuff that happens inside the sequencer, I will try to make the tutorial as comprehensive as possible for you so you can transfer settings to other synthesizers as well. My name is Janis, by the way, and let's jump right into it. Since we're going to create the sequence inside pigments, we need to compose one static MIDI note, for example some C2, that we can send into pigments, so there's actually some signal, otherwise it won't create any sound. Before we start, let's head over to the settings and change the play mode to mono, because this way the sequence is going to sound tighter and we don't get some overlap that causes some unwanted frequencies. One thing I really like about pigments is that you can create sequences super quickly in the style you want to go for. So if we want to make some acid sequence, we can activate the sequencer, go to the generation menu and actually pick some acid mode. And if you're not using pigments, you can see that the nodes for acid are the same as for Phrygian. I mean, here you have those tiny controls that let you determine the chance for those nodes if you're using random algorithms. But basically they have the same tone amount, so you can check the Phrygian scale for finding nodes that somewhat sound like acid. And once you pick acid, you can just click on the dice icon and then it will generate some random sequence based on those Phrygian or acid nodes for you. So now, for example, I like this sequence and we'll go back to the sequencer and explore those other features here more in depth. But for now, we have to also find a sound that is more enjoyable to work with. So we head over to the synth engine, and this kind of acid character really comes from a sweet spot between the cutoff frequency of the filter and the resonance. And here we also have some different filter modes to choose from. I really like the MS-20. I also read that it's particularly great for acid sounds. And I must say it gives this character, definitely, but you can experiment with all sorts of filters. It's basically always some sort of sweet spot between cutoff and resonance. And for the waveform, I recommend starting with something simple like a sawtooth waveform or some square wave. We'll also check some other options here in a second, but first, let's find a sweet spot here between cutoff and resonance. Something like this, but we need some more movement because it sounds really static, and the best thing to do is to apply some envelope to the cutoff frequency, so like some filter envelope. And I like to create a second one here, so we could use the main VCA, but we're going to do things here that we don't want to use for the filter envelope, so we use envelope 2. I mean, we have 3 envelopes, so it's not that we have to use the same envelope for everything. And mainly the decay is important for the sound here. So if we apply it first to the cutoff frequency with quite a solid amount, let's then see where again it sounds cool and where the decay actually has the coolest impact on the sound. Yeah, this is basically the sound effect we were looking for. And since we have 2 filters here, we can actually add a second one with basically the same settings. And that's just a feeling that I often have with any type of effect or also filter, that you can nicely enhance the effect by using it twice with some mild setting, because here you can see the resonance at some certain point doesn't sound great anymore, but we can actually add a second filter, use similar settings, maybe a bit different, but kind of basically the same, assign the envelope again. So we can see if we can enhance this kind of resonant filter sound even more without making it sound too goofy. Ooh. Actually, that's pretty cool. And this definitely gives us some acid vibe already. You can also consider adding some keyboard tracking, so the filter reacts a little to the pitch. So if the pitch is lower, it doesn't open as much, and it opens more when the pitch is higher. Can sound quite musical. So you see the bass note actually sounds really deep now with the filtering, which sounds super cool. And it sounds super great with the sawtooth wave, but actually, since we have a wavetable synth, It's incredibly fun, and that's just something I can encourage you to do in case you're using some wavetable synth, to try different wavetables. And I mean, Pigments has so many different wavetables. Actually, under Pigments 5, you can also find some acid wavetables. And it's not like because it says acid, it's going to be the best wavetable. You should check everything. Sometimes you get great sounds from something that doesn't sound at all like what you're trying to create. But actually here, those acid tables sound really great, especially if you modulate the position. And the modulation of the position you can actually do with some LFO, and that's something I really like to create some. Actually, we have to change the settings first to create some sine wave LFO rather slow, like 0.1 hertz, for example. And I also prefer the free running mode because this means it doesn't react to the sequence start or some triggering. We actually get some ongoing modulation that can also overlap bar lines, because that's also a great technique for actually making sequences less static, to have elements that don't react to the bar lines or the start of the sequence. And then we just apply this LFO to the position. And maybe a tiny amount. I think it sounds better in those upper positions. And one thing that is always fun to try is to add some unison detune. I mean, it's kind of a simple thing to add, but I often do it because it just sounds pretty cool. Just reduce a bit the stereo width. I don't know, I just really like it. Also, once you have some free running slow LFO, it's super fun to just see what it does to different parameters. So for example, I like to assign this with a tiny amount to the filter cutoff frequency. So it gives you the feeling that somebody's constantly modulating the cutoff frequency with the hands, but actually it's happening automatically, and this can have some super cool effect. I think that's a cool foundation. I'll show you some more cool modulations later, but I want to head over to the sequencer now because we can have some more in-depth look on how we can actually create the tonal content. And the great thing here is that you can always create new sequences with just one click. I've shown you in the beginning. And you can randomize basically everything. So if you want to go really crazy, you can actually increase the random amount for the pitch to 100%, also the probability for the individual notes, and maybe even the octaves, the gate length, and the slide, and then also automate the generation of new melodies by clicking on off. And maybe every bar we want to have some new sequence, and now you will get some completely new randomized sequence by every bar, but they will always be based on this kind of acid scale, or actually the Phrygian scale. And why this sounds kind of cool, I feel like it's too random, because there's also a cool sweet spot between fixing some steps but also leaving some space for randomness, which is what you actually heard in the intro example. Because you can lock steps. So I recommend to turn off the auto regeneration for now, to have a little bit of randomization for the pitch, but just for finding some main sequence. Also the probability, let's bring it down so it sometimes leaves out steps, but we have a few more triggers actually. And also the octave setting was a bit extreme. Maybe the gate length and slide can be cool, but we'll do it more consciously in a bit. Now, what you can actually do is find one sequence that you like, either by composing it here or by pressing the dice a couple of times. And actually, that's some pretty cool sequence here. So let's lock some steps. And when you lock steps, it's important that you click on the note once before locking it, because otherwise the plugin thinks it's a random note and you actually didn't want to compose it. So once you click the lock icon, it's going to lock the step. You should see actually the velocity was changed as well. I think the velocity doesn't have an impact on anything right now. But if it was created randomly, if you want to keep some of the settings here, you need to click on it once in order to save it. And somehow with those acid sequences, I always like when there's like a melodic part that is intense and then there's a pause. And I feel like those 4 notes here are really charismatic, especially with the pause after them. So, oh, see, that was exactly the mistake. I have to click on the notes once before I can lock them. And also here you see that it made some changes to the octave, which sounded really cool. So I'm going to lock those steps. And also I'm going to lock this step because it sounded pretty cool that there's actually a gap. And if I now go back to auto regenerate a new sequence, every bar, it will only generate new content for the positions that are not locked. So let's see what happens. Kind of cool. And so this is really up to you where you want to go. So if you prefer some crazy randomness or if you want to have something really composed with just a tiny amount of variation, that's all possible here. And it's just really inspiring to play around with it. One other thing I like is to play with the gate length. And actually, let's start by putting this all the way to the bottom for all the steps. So you can actually see what it does to the sound. And also this one doesn't get changed because the dice is at 0%. Oh, we missed this one, but you can see it's really short this way, but you can include some sort of rhythmic pattern if you actually increase it for certain steps. So let's say we want to have something crazy like a 5/4 thing. So we have the pattern of it's a long, short, short, and then we repeat this pattern basically a couple of times. And let's see how it sounds like. So that's actually a fun thing to play with, and then you can consider turning on the polymetry. And I don't know why it always changes the length once you click on it. I don't want to start this way right away, but that means that you can have or set different lengths for the different parameters here. So for the gate length, if we want to have the kind of 5/4 rhythmic pattern, we can say, okay, we play it twice, so it's 10, 2 times 5, and then it basically repeats itself. So for this row, the sequence jumps back to the beginning earlier, so those values will get applied to different notes, which can cause really interesting results. And you see that it always jumps back to the beginning once the MIDI clip starts, because that's when the sequence gets re-triggered. So if you want to have some longer cycles, just go to your MIDI clip and make it longer. So if I make it, for example, 4 bars, we will have way more of this rhythmic interplay. But again, this is already turning a little crazy again, but still you can decide how far you want to go. I like to add some modulation to the gate length because this brings in some super dynamic feeling. And also those short ones, I mean, I made them super short for demonstration purposes, but I don't want them to be so short. So let's actually lift them a little. And depending on where they are here, I mean, that's also where the modulation happens. So if you make the steps all super long, they will also more often be super long, although they get kind of modulated every bar. Compared to when it's all super short, that means that it's basically short, but you get some modulations that make it more long, so you can still have an impact on how the modulation or the variation actually sounds like. And that's actually some cool vibe here. So now that we got the sequence running, it actually sounds super cool, but we can explore the sound possibilities a little further. For example, I think one oscillator is totally fine. I think the utility engine was off anyways. Yep, but you can also look for another wavetable that maybe sounds cool together with the wavetable you're already using. So actually, let's pick wavetable here. And you actually, maybe you remember that there was also acid low res or just acid. So let's just take another acid waveform and see what it does to the sound. It's just fun to explore. Sounds kind of cool. I think we have to lower the volume a little, otherwise we're close to clipping. And we can actually add the same modulation. So this free running LFO that we're already using for wavetable position 1, we can also just use for wavetable position 2. And with the wavetable engine, it's always kind of fun to goof around with those knobs here. So for example, I like the wave folding if you open it a little and then you modulate basically this folding amount. Because at this point it's just about finding other layers that make the sound less static. Again, because we're a little lazy, we can use the first LFO. I mean, you could also create another one because we still have 2 left. Although we're going to use the second LFO for something else in a bit. But could be cool to just have a little motion here. If you're working with 2 layers, it's also fun to explore different frequency modulations for one of them. So if I increase this amount to 1, like the maximum, and browse through the different tunings for the FM, you might find some cool spots as well. Can sound quite sick. And here you actually get some cool overtones, and I think together it sounds pretty cool. Another super fun thing is to mess with the envelopes, and now we're going to use some new LFO, and for sending out random values, Pigments is so amazing because you get LFOs that can send out random values. Actually, it's selected here already. It's the sample and hold random one. And here we want to have the Poly keyboard trigger source, which means with every trigger, it sends out a new value, which is pretty amazing. And it also has the random envelope, so actually the random waveforms here. So there's so much stuff you can do. And I like to assign LFO2, like the random LFO, to the attack of our filter envelope, because this is some super interesting variation that you get if the attack is sometimes a little delayed. Just see what happens. I really like this. There are also some effects that really make sense for sequences like this, so let's check some of those. First of all, I like to actually experiment with distortion, but Bit Crusher is often what I prefer. I don't know why. There's just some magic to destroying the sound and slightly mixing it in with the original signal. So let's actually move this to 100% and explore a bit the different sounds. Sounds so cool. And actually, here it's some cool effect it has. The signal gets a bit softer, but doesn't really matter. Then we can also add some EQ for just pointing out the best frequencies. It's actually the opposite of applying surgical EQ. This is just a thing of browsing and seeing where actually the sound gets better, simply put. Usually it's on the higher frequencies. So it looks a bit like drawing some mountain stage profile for the Tour de France. But I kind of like it. It just gets a little more active this way. And also, flangers actually sound super cool for this type of sequence. I am very bad at explaining what it really does, to be honest. I just move the knobs until it has some cool effect. I like this feedback type effect. And actually those effects have quite some strong impact on the sound. And actually without them it sounds also super cool. Generally, I think it's a decision of what fits your arrangement, because for just listening to a preset, it's always great to use effects, because also when you browse through your preset libraries, usually they add lots of effects, so they sound great when you preview the sounds. But for using them in some song, it's just some totally different story. But I mean, just for adding some sort of fun stuff, this is cool. And also one last thing, this is really something technical, but it helps, adding a compressor, because if you're working with sounds that create lots of resonances, they can peak really quickly without noticing. And that's also, I mean, you saw that I had to dial back the volume. And it's very cool to just add a compressor with a fast attack time, fast release time. I would increase the ratio and just take away like 5 dB maybe for making the sound a bit tighter. And now you should have some good amount of tools for creating your own cool acid sequences. But before you go and try those techniques for yourself, just please take a quick second to click the like button and be also warmly invited to subscribe, because I post tutorials about Arturia Pigments, but also generally making synth stuff and also about music production in general. Also, if you're interested in having those patches, I'll upload them to my Patreon. Link is down below in the description. And if you're also up for more pigment stuff, there's a video here about making minimal techno, also featuring the sequencer. And since I'm curious about playing and exploring techno, here's another video about techno genres explained from a drummer's point of view. Apart from that, I wish you lots of inspiration with whatever it is that you create, and hope to see you soon again at this channel. Bye.